So guys, in today's video I want to share something with you that I have been obsessing about for a very long time. I'm a huge fan of kind of cyberpunk themed science fiction, you know, like dark, rainy alleys, gritty neon signs, puddles reflecting light and stuff like that. We've seen that aesthetic across games, across movies, kind of spearheaded by Blade Runner, right? That was the first movie that really established this aesthetic. But the inspiration for that aesthetic came from, for many directors and artists, from one specific place. And that is Kowloon Walled City, the City of Darkness. First of all, I'm going to give you guys a quick rundown of what it is, what it's all about. It won't take too long. And then we're going to dive deeper, right? And look at, for example, a report of a girl who lived in the neighborhood of the place and actually tells firsthand what it was to live close to it. So Kowloon Walled City was a real place in Hong Kong. And in the beginning, it just looked pretty much like a normal part of the city with a few blocks of flats and smaller houses around. It has a longer history, and we're going to go into that in the end when we read the article from the girl who lived in the neighborhood. There we go into the actual history, what happened before the actual urban part of this story. But that's what I want to focus on, because obviously the focus here is like cyberpunk culture and how we got to that aesthetic. So in 1945, like some Civil War refugees occupied big parts of this area, basically was squatted. Then the government, the local government, were trying to drive them out in around 1948. But because of like territorial discrepancies, and obviously like Hong Kong was occupied by Britain during that time, so the British government kind of just laid like a hands-off attitude to Kowloon Walled City, and they said, yeah, that's not our problem, we're not dealing with this place. And the Chinese government also couldn't drive these people out, so it became kind of this untouchable spot, right? There was no police in this area anymore. It was run by the Triads, right, which is like the Chinese mafia. They were operating the whole thing. But Kowloon Walled City became a safe haven for anyone who was fleeing from the government. Right? It was basically a lawless place for refugees from society. Whatever trouble you had outside of Kowloon Walled City, inside, nobody could touch you. And at the time, Hong Kong had like a massive problem with all kinds of crime. So there was a massive demand, a huge hunger for space in the walled city, because so many people wanted to get away from Hong Kong, maybe from the people who were chasing them or whatever, threatening them. So they were like, we need to move to this place in order to be safe, right? At least there the police can't catch us. So what happened was, because there are no rules, no police, no regulation, the city doesn't interfere, people just started to build structures upon structures, of course without any permission or coherent plans. It was just in order to accommodate more people. And they kept building up, and that's also where the name City of Darkness comes from, because in the lower levels of that place, there was no sunlight, because it was so obscurely built on top of each other, and it was so densely populated that there was basically no sunlight. There was never any sunlight on the lower levels. But this structure that people built became the most densely populated area on Earth at the time, okay? So by 1990, around 50,000 residents lived in the city, and the city had a footprint of about 2.6 hectare. That's about 2.5 rugby fields, okay? Just to get an idea. 50,000 people in the borders of 2.5 rugby fields stacked upon each other. So what was developed there out of the pure necessity of space is an extremely unique architecture, and basically just an unprecedented architectural experiment. I don't know of any example where a space was just left alone like that, was so overly populated, and people could just do whatever they wanted. I mean, imagine the plumbing in this space, right? We're going to talk about that a bit later in the video, but it must have been nasty. Rats, things like that. You have no regulations. You have nobody who checks whether the space is clean or not, or friendly for children to live in and things like that. So it's a crazy experiment, but in a way, the walled city kind of became its own ecosystem, because many people could never leave that place. They were stuck in the place because when they go out, there's a risk that they get caught, because everybody there had some kind of problem with the law or someone outside of the walled city. So they had to produce their own food, for example, and they did it in fact at super cheap prices, very competitive prices to the outside world. So I know of reports of people, restaurants outside of the walled city, buying some ingredients for their foods inside the walled city, because it was basically the cheapest method of getting to that food. But there were people getting old there. There were people growing up in this cube, and there are beautiful documentaries on YouTube. I'm going to link them all down in the description. One is, I think, from an Austrian. Watch it yourself. It's so fascinating, because they're going through the labyrinth, through the cube, and just looking around, filming people in their everyday life situations, basically. The walled city produced 2 tons of garbage a day. It had an illegal dentist, basically a dentist without a license. It had a nursery, a kindergarten for kids to go to, a volunteer fire brigade, a racing pigeon breeder, noodle makers, loads of restaurants that just produced food for the surrounding area, plastic bag manufacturer, metal workshops, and everything was organized and held together by the Triads, right? You have to keep that in mind. This place was run by the mafia. And you would think, my God, this is horrible. Like, look at these pictures. This is like dystopian, dark stuff. Everybody there must have had the worst time of their life and only talk horrible about their experience. Wrong. In fact, a lot of people who used to live there, including a lot of the children, say it was great. We had a great time. We could play on the roofs, and it was like a labyrinth. We could run around. We loved the place. Of course, the Walled City had like massive problems with prostitution, drugs, crime in general. But at the same time, it was not deemed a particularly dangerous place for its residents. It's not like, oh, if you go into the Walled City, if you live there, you're going to die, man, and the mafia's going to kill you. No, it wasn't. It was actually perceived by the residents as a fairly safe place. The dangerous place was outside the Walled City, right? That's how they perceived it. So the place was 14 stories high by the end of it. Okay, so imagine that. 14 stories of structures built without permission, without plans. It's just stacked on top of each other. And the government only interfered once when a building exceeded, I think, the 150 feet height limit, right? It got over that, and because there's an airport close by, they were like, all right, chaps, you do whatever you want, but don't go over 150 feet. And they didn't. They kind of worked with the government, and it worked out for everyone. But that was kind of the only time where the government said, guys, excuse me, you should. But against what people like you and me might expect, thinking of this as kind of an urban hell, the worst place on earth, by the way, Reddit/urban hell. Check that out. Nice subreddit if you're interested in dystopian architecture. But if you look at the documentaries and the reports from the people who lived there, it really just seemed like a place where ordinary people were just trying to get by in the best way they could, making the best of their situation, staying positive and optimistic. But of course, to the Chinese government as well as the British government, this really became like an unwanted spot. It's a problem for Hong Kong. You don't want this triad-run, locked-off crime habitat in the middle of your city, right? Nobody wants that. The authorities tried several times to clear the Walled City before a successful plan was finally implemented, and demolition began in February 1993. Police had to forcefully evict a few hundred residents that refused to leave. So there were quite a few people, a few hundred, right? That's quite a few people, and they refused to leave. They wanted to stay there. But it was fully demolished in 1993, and I think today we just have a park in the place where it used to be, which is nice as well. But it's really regretful, I feel, that they didn't save this place for visitors as a piece of history, because especially, like I said, if you look at these aesthetics, they've been adapted over and over again. They've been so incremental of like visual aesthetics of video games and pop culture nowadays that it's such a shame that like such a big root of all that aesthetic was just destroyed. Because at the time it didn't fit into the narrative, and it's just a dirty slum, basically, right? So let's just take it down. In hindsight, I think that's a real shame, because I think a lot of people would have been interested to walk through this now. What an amazing example of architecture. What a unique view on people living in a dense space. I would have paid any entrance price to walk through that space, honestly. Let's talk about a few examples where we can see Kowloon Walled City pop up in movies, in pop culture. For example, Bloodsport. You remember the Van Damme movie? The kumite, the actual fight, right, the tournament, happens in Walled City. There's a little scene where they walk up to the structure and there's this big guy out and they're like, you can't come in here. That's supposed to be the Walled City. I think they mention it in one side sentence, so it's not a big deal, but it is in there, and it is part of that movie as well. Deus Ex, Mankind Divided, the Polish ghetto that they have, is an absolute aesthetic that's directly taken from these Walled City aesthetics. Call of Duty Black Ops had a map called Kowloon, in which you play on the roofs of Walled City. It's actually a really fun map. I was always very happy when that came on. There's a dedicated horror video game called Paranormal HK Hong Kong, Paranormal Hong Kong, which I think plays entirely in Kowloon Walled City, and I have it on my wish list. I'm waiting for it. Not a huge horror game fan, but I'll download it at some point and play it maybe on the channel. There's a restaurant in Japan that emulates this style, right? The whole restaurant looks like you're sitting inside Kowloon Walled City, which is fascinating. Mr. Pumpkin 2, Kowloon Walled City, right? That game also has that subtitle, plays in Walled City. Obviously, it's more like a cartoonish adaptation of the story. But there are so many references in movies, games, and so on, comics, to this aesthetic that I felt it's worth talking to you guys about this. So this was very much the top line rundown. And if you have enough and you're like, yeah, I heard enough, it's a nice story, don't care, leave me alone. Fine, you can leave now. Because what we're going to do, if you still care, is we're going to read a report from a girl that was living next to Kowloon Walled City. And now she's an adult. And she writes about her experience and how she experienced or perceived this urban hell, right, if you want. Let's get into it. So we're going to read this article in the Salient magazine, issue 22 from the 21st of September. This article has been written by Sharon Lamb. At the time, she was an intern at the Arch Daily. And she published in Salient, a magazine of the Victoria University of Wellington Students Association, blah, blah, blah. And she wrote an article that's called In the Shadow of Kowloon Walled City. And that's what we're going to read. It is the 1970s in Hong Kong, and you are 11 years old. Early one evening, you go out to a nearby neighborhood for dinner with your family, a 5-minute walk from your primary school. It is also a place you frequent with your friends. The food here is good and especially renowned for its fishball noodle soup, which is what you always get. You've been here so often that navigating the subterranean corridors of the noodle stand is easy, and you know where to step in order to avoid the ceilings that drip you the most. Your bowl of noodles arrive and you slurp them down, unaware of the fact that over the next couple of years, this very neighborhood will peak in its population and its infamy and remain even decades later as one of the most remarkable social anomalies in recent history. At its peak, Kowloon Walled City was home to 33,000 people in just 2 hectares of land. Wikipedia says 50,000, so we're differing here a little bit. I don't know which one is the real number. Probably it's even very hard to track the real number. The size of about 2 rugby fields, making it the densest place on Earth at the time. It was a hastily put together conglomerate of tiny apartments, one on top of the other, caged balconies slapped onto the sides and connected through a labyrinth of dark corridors. All the while, the rest of Hong Kong went about as normal, seemingly unaffected by the crime and squalor within the walled city. This unique society and its complete neglect by the rest of Hong Kong was born of the equally unique political conditions of the Kowloon site. So now we're talking a little bit about the history of the site before we talk about the urban story that I kind of brought up. Initially a Chinese outpost for the salt trade during the Song dynasty, it was later turned into a military outpost with an added coastal fort in the 1800s. When China lost to the British in the First Opium War, Hong Kong was ceded and officially handed over in 1842. However, the Kowloon site was an exception, with the British allowing the Chinese to stay at the site as long as they didn't politically interfere. China went on to fully reclaim the ownership of the Kowloon site in 1947, but its separation from the mainland meant they did little to enforce laws, while Britain also went with a hands-off policy, like I mentioned before. Free from both sides of the law, squatters soon flooded in, and so began the legend of Kowloon Walled City. By 1950, the population had grown to 17,000. People moved to the walled city out of bankruptcy, lack of choice, and to either flee or exploit the lack of the law. Construction proliferated alongside the population, a truly modern vernacular free from any building regulations or code. Within the darkness of the walled city, crime, unregulated businesses, everything from opium dens and brothels to plastic bags and spring rolls, and family life went on day after day. It was until 1984 that both governments decided that the walled city has become enough of a backwards embarrassment and eyesore that they had to tear it down. In 1992, residents were evicted and given monetary compensation, and the site was converted into a public commemorative park. Now that's interesting because my research said it was demolished in 1993, around that time. I actually saw a few sources that said demolition started in 1993. It's also February 93, so it might be late 1992. Something like this. Despite my many, often lengthy trips to Hong Kong, I have never visited the park. It is not well advertised or a well heard of tourist attraction, nor is it a place of local pride. In fact, it was born from the mouth of a Swede that I first heard of Kowloon Walled City, and each time since then the Walled City has come up, it's been from Caucasian commentary. In my urban design paper, the Kowloon Walled City was brought up as an example of a slum. that showed the consequence of lack of building regulations. There was no mention of the delicious bowls of noodles one could find there. Rather, the Kowloon Walled City is in conversation usually described as post-apocalyptic, scary, and crazy. Compare this to the way in which my dad talks about the city. A smirk broke across his face as soon as the name was mentioned, and I was surprised to learn that his primary school was just next door from this crazy mess of drugs, gangs, and crime. In fact, most of our conversation focused on the food that you could find there. He describes the place as very special, both as the only place in Hong Kong that went unaffected by British rule and has a unique community in itself. He went on to describe the physical environment of the place with an energy that I've only otherwise seen during one of his jam-making frenzies. Smiling, he recalled the constant dripping of water leaks everywhere and the surreal disappearance of the sky once you entered. He also went on about the many unregulated businesses there, with special mention to the many unlicensed dentists that could operate liability-free, and also the dog meat stalls, which found success while canine cuisine was illegal in the rest of Hong Kong. He admits that he knew of people being mugged and that people generally avoided the place after the dark, but otherwise my dad complimented the Triads on their organization of the Walled City, acting as a de facto city council. Which is true, right? The city council of that place was the mafia, albeit one funded by drugs and enforced through violence. The Triads organized a volunteer fire brigade, rubbish disposal, they resolved civil conflict, particularly those between competing businesses. The way my dad speaks of Walled City with something approaching pride gives a very different impression to its popular depiction. It is much easier to tell a story of a depraved lifestyles in a dark maze of inhumane living conditions. This isn't to say that that wasn't the case, but rather that this wasn't the only story that Walled City had to tell. And that's why I find it so interesting that she's kind of going back and telling the story as like an 11-year-old girl. Like, it's so fascinating. As a small child, you don't see it as this cesspool of crime and prostitution. You just go there to eat noodles, and you jump over the puddles, and it's kind of a fun game because you learn the puddles, and after a while you don't even need to look. You're just jumping, It's so interesting to get that perspective on a space that would obviously, like she says, be doomed a slum, right? Dangerous. Nobody should go there. I just found those two angles on this place so interesting. A documentary on the Walled City chronicled this complexity firsthand, filmed by an Austrian with English subtitles, and it's on YouTube. Go watch it now. I think it's 5 or 6 parts, each like 10 minutes. The 1980s film gives an intimate look at life in the Walled City. We meet a breeder of illegal racing pigeons, an alternative to betting on horses, a kindergarten, even a Triad-funded pensioner. All these stories, however, are set against a dark, dim architectural backdrop. It is a strange experience. Harrowing English subtitles that compare the people to the dead rats nobody takes umbrage at. But their attempt at shock horror is heckled by the background Cantonese with children wittingly mocking the camera crew. This perhaps best represents Hong Kong, scary from the outside but energetic normality within. That is a beautiful quote. Now, I haven't been to Hong Kong myself, but I've traveled quite a lot of places in China, and that describes it really well. It's a bit scary from the outside because it's different. It's dark. It's different. We don't know. But on the inside, it's just energetic normality. It's just normal. It's just normal people living their lives. So there's kind of a lesson here about judging things by its cover. Looking at something that's ugly, that's not pretty, that's run by the mafia, that has horrible stories coming out of it. But there's more to it. And I think that's why this is so fascinating, because you expect it to be just the worst, but reading these stories and these reports, and there are more of those, they don't sound like it's the worst. While it would be false to say that the documentary makers were exaggerating the extent of the squalid conditions, poverty, and cramped spaces, these qualities are only striking in their intensity, not at all in their absurdity. In fact, the most Louis Theroux-ish thing in the whole documentary is an English missionary who resides in the Walled City, curing heroin addicts due her spiritual touch. Right? She's healing all these addicts just by touching them. It's true. It's a really bizarre scene in that documentary. Yes, the rest of the picture is grossly inhumane. Yes, but illogical? No. Given the conditions and consequences in which the city was conceived and its complete neglect, it could have turned out a whole lot worse. Very valid point in my opinion. The surprising liveliness and community of the Walled City shows that when free from law and liability, things aren't gonna be that great. But they also do not have to be an entire failure. When the Kowloon Walled City was torn down by the outside forces, many of its residents were dissatisfied with their eviction, and not even financial compensation restored the community they left behind. Many years on, even when fully resettled into the rest of Hong Kong, looking back at the days in the Walled City, many people look back at the days in the Walled City as happier times. When still under British rule, it was important to remember that the Kowloon Walled City was not the only place of such density in Hong Kong. Contemporary to the Walled City were other urban squatter settlements, also ad hoc conglomerations, but only of one story. And roomier, with just 4,900 people per hectare, which means about 2 square meters per person. The settlements sprang up from the population boom of the 1950s, when Chinese refugees fled into the city following political turmoil in the mainland, after their family land was taken and their relatives killed. Both my dad's mother and my mother's mother were such refugees, and they both experienced some time in informal settlements upon arriving in Hong Kong. They were both lucky, however, and were soon able to settle into a more comfortable and stable condition, helped by the government's public housing schemes. With this ancestry, my own upbringing as a Hong Kong-born New Zealand citizen irks me to see a persistent fascination with the current density of housing, in particular in Hong Kong. While physically long gone, the shadow of the walled city and its colonial conceptions remains. The multiple photography series, Gorg tourism, and critique of the city's newer ending apartment towers has not so distant roots in the outsider curiosity that drew British colonials to the walled city as tourist attraction in its early days. The common, lazy judgment thrown upon unfamiliar cultures is everywhere. Online, in conversation, and even from university tutors, I have come across phrases like, "How can people live like that?" And so crazy how crammed it must be in regards to small living spaces in Hong Kong and other Southeast Asian metropolises. Often these phrases are followed by a smug thankfulness that they themselves do not have to live in such terrible conditions. My grandmother has, from her arrival into Hong Kong to the current day, lived in public housing. These towers are the most ubiquitous building form in Hong Kong, largely identical and replicated over and over across the city, often painted in pastel for both differentiation and a happy aesthetic. There are over 680,000 apartments across 160,000 public housing estates, with 15,000 more apartments built every year. Just as with the walled city, there's rarely any mention of the lives within the towering walls, nor the delicious bowls of noodles. And I think the rest of the story goes much more into like social housing problems within Hong Kong and the story of her grandmother, which is interesting but is not really relevant for what we're doing here. So this is really what I wanted to talk about to you guys, because I think this is such a fascinating story from a design point of view, right? For a designer, where these aesthetics come from, or movies and so on, but also from an urban and human and living side of things. It's such a unique situation where so many people are forced to live in such a dense space. Yet you can see people don't talk about it negatively now in hindsight, looking back. And to be honest, I have friends who grew up in the east side of Germany, which was, very suppressed and very communist at the time. And they also say not everything was bad, right? Yes, we were suppressed. Yes, we couldn't go to the West. We didn't have many things that other people had, but there were many positive memories and many positive things happened there. So I guess the message that I hope that you guys would take from this video is, don't judge things by its cover. Yes, the walled city looks horrible. If you look at it from the outside, it is the archetype of a ghetto or a slum. But what happens behind the walls is often a different story. Yes, there are the horrible stories, but there's more to it. And I mean, that applies to everything. That applies to people, that applies to how people live, and it mainly applies to other cultures. We are often so caught up in our own cultural bubble and what we perceive to be normal that we can't accept or imagine that many other people have a completely different normal, and that's completely fine. That's okay. I don't need to kind of put myself in a better or privileged position over someone else who might live only on a third of the space that I have, because cultures are different, people are different. And I think this story is a beautiful lesson that teaches us about that. So guys, this is another very long video and very different, and it doesn't involve rooster teeth. If you watched it to this point, man, this is great. You guys are amazing. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you learned something. I hope you had some fun. Smash the like button, hit the subscribe if you haven't done that yet. Smash the bell so you don't miss the next video. I see you guys next time. I'm out. Bye.